And she gets to Galena, and she gets off the boat in Galena. There's one black guy living in Galena, and he comes up and looks at her and says, "Young lady, you're passing. You're in real danger. We got to get you out of here." So he helps her get on a stagecoach to Milwaukee, of all places. And in fact, the slave catchers were on her heels. There was a bounty of $800 to capture Caroline Quarles because she was valuable property. That's the equivalent of $15,000. Property worth $15,000, you go after. And so the slave catchers went after. And Carolyn goes on this remarkable journey up the Mississippi River by stage to Milwaukee. The abolitionists in Milwaukee had never seen a fugitive slave. They didn't know what to do with the freedom seekers. And so they had these hairbreadth adventures because the slave catchers had arrived in Milwaukee and knew Caroline was there, and so they kept moving her from house to house. And one day she hid in a big pickle barrel because they couldn't vouch for any house where they could keep her safe. Finally, the abolitionists agreed that one of their numbers, a retired bachelor, would be her escort, and they went by buggy, and they came down around, and they came down through Dundee and Elgin to Naperville, Lockport, Hickory Grove, which is New Lenox, and they came and they stayed with the Beebe family across the street from the Cushions. And they went to the church. And there's this great story about Caroline in the church in Crete challenging the kids in Sunday school to talk about what freedom means. And she understood what freedom meant. And then she went on across Indiana and settled in Canada, fell in love with a fellow who had escaped from Kentucky. They married and had 6 children. And Lil and I have had the delightful experience of getting to know Caroline's great-granddaughter very well. Charlotte Watkins. Her husband's name was Alan Watkins. Carolyn Quarles and Alan Watkins. Their great-granddaughter, Charlotte Watkins. Charlotte is, have you seen this picture of them? Yeah, okay. Charlotte is now 84, and in the 1950s she won several nationwide vocal competitions in Canada, and she spent 20 years touring the capitals of Europe with African-Canadian jazz bands. And it's just such a glorious thing to count her as a friend. We also got to know very well a woman named Kimberly Simmons, and Kim is Caroline's great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter, and Kimberly assisted me in writing the book. But it's just a glorious, glorious story. Now remember that Carolyn's white family were really proud of their revolutionary heritage. In 1843, when Carolyn decided she was going to be a free person, she made that declaration and left on the 4th of July. How about that? You know, how about saying to your family, okay, you think you know something about freedom, I know something about freedom. And she was a free soul. Just kind of remarkable. Okay, now finally, in 1841, this is my final story.
How late can you stay?
Well, I know the library closes at some point, but I got another 5 minutes, then we'll have questions. In 1841, John and Eliza Little are enslaved on adjoining farms in western Tennessee. And John had come out of Virginia, and we're pretty sure that John's parents were among some of the last slaves captured in Africa and brought to the United States. Because John was what some people would call a hard case. John had a rough time because he always objected to his enslavement. And he had the bruises and the marks of punishment to show that. But John Little always said, I am proud that I have not an ounce of white blood in me. I am the son of African princes. So John meets Eliza on an adjoining farm. They fall in love and get married, and realize if they're ever going to have a life together, they have to run. They have to seize their freedom. And so John and Eliza, and those of you that know geography, you know, if you don't, you're going to know now. The Tennessee River is one of the few major American rivers that flows north. You know, think about it. Everything else kind of flows south, right? But the Tennessee River comes out of the Appalachians and it goes across Tennessee, dips down into northern Alabama, and then it turns sharply north and goes north through Tennessee and Kentucky to the Ohio River. So if you want to be free, you go north. If you want to be free, you get to where the Little River meets the Big River, where the Tennessee meets the Ohio, and you get into Illinois. The next time you hear somebody sing "Follow the Drinking Gourd," they're going to sing where the Little River meets the Big River, and that's following the Tennessee north to the Ohio. So John and Eliza take their satchel, they run away from their farms, they head north following the Tennessee River. They get up near the Ohio, in a swampy area. They got to get through the swamp. And John, years later, told the story. He said, I remember when we came to the swamp, and I put Eliza on a log, and I put our possessions behind her, and I pushed that log through the swamp. And I knew that at any misstep, and everything that I loved and cared for would be gone. And he pushed that log through the swamp. They got to the Ohio River. They borrowed a rowboat. He got across the Ohio River. And when they got to the other side, they ran into some other freedom seekers. Other people had escaped. And these people were really discouraged. And one of them said, you know what we ought to do? We're just a few miles from K Road. Why don't we go over to K Road, turn ourselves in, we'll go back south. And if we turn ourselves in, maybe our masters will not beat us. Maybe they'll just receive us because we're turning ourselves in. And John and Eliza would have none of that. And Eliza said to them, I know where I have been, and I will not return. And if I need to, I will walk barefoot to Chicago to find my freedom. John and Eliza Little in 1841 walked 370 miles to get to Chicago. And when they got there, they found some abolitionists. We don't know if they were white or black, but some abolitionists that helped them a little bit and said, if you're going to be free, you got to leave. And so John and Eliza walked out of Chicago, and they came down. They went across that bridge on the Little Calumet. And they walked down Michigan City Road, and they made it to Michigan City. And they walked to Detroit. And they walked into Canada. And they were free human beings. Now, part of our common task is to understand this part of our history and to know that there were really serious times when white people and black people were working together to help people that were caught in slavery. And this is our great civil rights legacy. And this is a story that we have to expand because it's a story that belongs to all of us. And it is so remarkable that right here in Crete, Illinois, you have some very central pieces of this remarkable story. So let's keep at it, and thank you.
Thank you so much. So if you want to turn the lights on, and Larry has his books and the...
Do we have time for a few questions?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, okay, why don't we take maybe 5-10 minutes and have some, just see if there, or maybe I've
No, we
answered
have
everything.
questions now. Are there any questions?
Any questions? Yes.
Did that marker ever come out of that closet?
Did the marker ever come out of the closet? Actually, I don't know. But next time you visit a Porter County Historical Society, somebody might ask. I don't know if it ever came out of the closet.
Where is that?
Yeah. Yes, right.
What did Cook County ever say to you about that marker on Saucon by West?
We have a, what did Cook County say to us? Some of the folks I've been working on the Little Calumet, we are involved with Bovian Woods Forest Preserve, and so we have a specific proposal in, which is currently being considered by Cook County Forest Preserve to do a county-wide Underground Railroad interpretation. I've identified 7 places around Cook County where we could establish markers, and they got a lot of money. And we'll see, but it's possible that they all of a sudden, they I think, chances are pretty good they're gonna pay for the study. And then, obviously, one of the things we're pushing them for is kind of phase 2, which would be the creation of the markers. But right on Sauk Trail, what is that, Sabona Woods picnic area?
Yeah.
Right there? But that'd be a natural place to have a all-weather markers and to have an all-weather map and say, you go down the bikeway and then have a point where you can walk over and wander around the McCoy site. And some of us are gonna do that. Okay, yes?
A few years ago, I saw what seemed to me west of Waltz, about a quarter mile or so, a staked out area where people were doing a dig, looked like an archaeological type. They were carefully digging. Is that got anything to do?
That was west of Waltz?
West of Waltz.
Okay, about a half mile west of Waltz, you saw some archaeological, Ryan, do you by chance know anything about this?
Yeah, that was William Williamson, and he was just an old pioneer. And anytime the state of Illinois, because they rerouted, exchange,
Yes,
anytime they're
that's
going to
right.
cover up an old site, they have to do an archaeology dig. And there's actually pictures of everything they found there downstairs in Mark Madsen's book about Indian trails in the area. It would be in that local history area.
Thank you.
Terrific. So it was a part of an archaeological dig related to the rerouting of exchange. Thank you. Okay. 1 or 2 more?
I just can't understand. I was a person in Tennessee and I wanted to get to Canada. How would I know how to start? How would I know where to go next? And who would help me along the way? In other words, was it like Europe? Did they have, like, I know who the next person is, and that person knows who the next person is?
That's a piece
the
of
way
it.
it went?
That's a piece of it. If you're in Western Tennessee, for example, how do you know where to go if you want to be free? The question. And in fact, first of all, we have to really affirm the kind of the courage of the folks that went for their freedom. And they knew you got to go north, that there was somehow freedom was north, and maybe you didn't know exactly how to get there. And then over time, among slave communities, it was and one of the things that we're just now beginning to really appreciate was very sophisticated connections. I mean, people talking to each other among slave communities, and so word got passed. We have now uncovered examples of primitive maps that were passed among slaves in the 1820s and 30s, and identifying Chicago. And so people had the impulse, go north, then you combine that with some information, and then you combine that with the fact that the word begins to spread about where you might find assistance. And like when you get up on the river, don't go to those houses to the west, but maybe the people over there might be somebody. And it was, helping fugitives was very serious. It was very much against the law. And yet, once you got into northern Illinois, it was very much an open secret. And so people had to be very careful, and those that decided morally to provide assistance had to be very careful in the South and in southern Illinois, southern Indiana. But once they got into the north, it was very much an open secret. Still very serious, still the potential of fines, but I love to use the example. And some of you will appreciate this, and others will not. Those of you that were around in the 1960s, marijuana was very illegal. However, everybody knew somebody. They knew somebody. See, you hear all those people chuckling? That was the case. I mean, I never smoked in the 60s, but I certainly knew people that knew people. And that if you want to do this legal stuff, people knew people that knew people. It was very much like that with the Underground Railroad. There were many people out of principle, I will not break the law. I think the law is unjust, but I will not break the law. However, you know, Sam Cushing, old Deacon Sam, I think he helps folks. And so, some freedom seekers show up on my farm, and I said, I'm sorry, but if you just go 3 miles down and ask for Sam Cushing's farm, they can help you. And so a lot of it was the impulse for freedom to just go and take the risk. Then there was the sharing of information, and then as this developed over time, by the time you get to about 1838, across the North, they've had enough experience with freedom seekers that there were real networks developing. And then, of course, once you got into the network, you could, you get to John and Martha Hasek, and Chicago's not good to go, so John and Martha asked you, will you go see the folks in Joliet? And the folks in Joliet say, stop at the Havens, the Havens stop with Cushing, and the Cushings, And so that information gets powerfully passed. Yeah.
I did have one question, and that was, a while back, a few years ago, when there was a big resurgence of interest in quilting, there was a lot of talk about legends about that the quilts were used with messages about ways
Yes.
to go.
Thank you for raising the
Were
underground
they really
quilts.
true?
No. This is fake history. And please, friends, please carry the word. Quilts are wonderful. Quilts can be used as wonderful educational devices. I've seen quilts related to the Underground Railroad, which are just beautiful, using kind of ancient symbols and so on. That's great. However, those are educational things. Were the quilts used in any way on the Underground Railroad? No. There is not a single piece of evidence that quilts were ever involved with the Underground Railroad. Please pass that on. There are a number of people, there are dozens of people around the country who are making pretty good money telling the Underground Railroad quilt stories, and it is all fake history. And it has, for my money, it has a lot of serious kind of racial problems embedded in that. So please, quilts are wonderful. I love people that make quilts as educational tools, great, but were quilts part of the Underground Railroad? No. Okay? This is not, take my advice. No, this is, I'm standing here as an authority. Please stop this story. But thank you for raising it. Because the quilts are wonderful, but they're not true. Yeah.
Several years ago, the First Reformed Church in South Holland had a wagon that
Yes.
showed,
Right.
with the false bottom where
Yeah.
they would hide
Yeah, years ago, First Reformed Church had a wagon with a false bottom. And we know that, like, for example, we got some of the stories with the Ton Farm, that there were times when there were a lot of slave catchers around, and so they had freedom seekers lie down in the wagon, and they put the corn on top to get them to ham it. And then they could, generally in the North, as long as you're discreet, traveling at night, or just being careful, you didn't have to do that. But when necessary, people were careful. Okay, 2 more questions. Yes, sir.
In Canada, do they accept them very well or not?
How were they accepted in Canada?
Yes.
There are today a group of wonderful, predominantly black communities in Canada. Of course, they're African Canadians, but they are all the descendants of freedom seekers that came into Canada. They had a very mixed experience. I would generalize and say it was, in general, like the Northern States experience. There were many places that they were accepted and could prosper. There were other places they experienced real discrimination. There were some places where they were part of integrated schools. Other places they were the black communities were forced to create their own schools. So it was a mixed experience. But I'll tell you, for one thing, the Canadian government has done an honorable, deeply honorable job of celebrating and recognizing this part of their history. The Canadians are way ahead of us in terms of understanding what a powerful movement this was, and to really salute the work they do. So, yes, sir.
You mentioned trappers, and
Yeah.
the original trapper, the original person in Chicago is south.
Right.
And to Vincennes Trail goes down to Moments. Was that part of the Underground Railroad at all? Because
Yes, good, and actually, right, I'm glad you raised that, because the Vincennes Trail is right there
Yes.
Or it's right here, I mean, okay. The Vincennes Trail, which becomes Hubbard's Trail, which becomes State Route 1, which becomes the Dixie Highway. That's all the same thing, okay? And comes out of Danville and Momence. It kind of comes right outside this library. It goes up. We have there's suggestive evidence. I would say it's in the probable category. There's really good evidence that freedom seekers, some freedom seekers, came up overland following the Vincennes Trace and would have walked right past this library. But I would say, maybe in the number in the dozens. Now, a thing I didn't talk about, but is very much related to that, where the Cushing farm, the Cushings and the Beebes and the Saffords and all, from there, they're old farm roads that kind of, part of them become old Cottage Grove Avenue. And that wiggles its way up to Thornton. And that was a route, we know, we've got documentation, the Cushings occasionally took, instead of sending them east into Valpo or to Crown Point, that occasionally, given the conditions, it made more sense for freedom seekers to go north into Chicago and get to Chicago and then go by ship to Canada. And so in those instances, getting to the Little Calumet going north, it was the reverse direction from where most of the freedom seekers went. But we know that it is very, very likely that at least some number, and again, I would put it in the dozens, not the hundreds, of freedom seekers independently and with the help of white farmers came right up Vincennes Trail and right past here. And I think for our collective children, part of what's really important is to say, the underground, God bless Harriet Tubman, but she was never within 1,000 miles of Illinois. In fact, we have a great, rich cycle of stories in Illinois. And we have hundreds of people who sought their freedom on the Sauk Trail, on Richton Road, on the Vincennes Trail, going in and out of Chicago. And that's an Illinois history that we ought to be talking about. So glad to be with you. Please buy a book.
Thank you so much. I just want to say one thing. The fifth and last book of our Crete member books, Carolyn Whalen Trebold, who lived on the Trebold farm, it used to be the Safford farm, and they found out new documentation that put their farm, the Saffords, right as part of, in a log cabin back then. So we have all this documented evidence in Crete, and we thank all of you for coming, and thank you, Larry McClelland.
My pleasure. Good to see you all.
Thank you.